On a blazing summer day, I noticed that Jose had not come to work. Late in the morning, the owner of the mercado, a woman named Diane, came in for her daily latte. I asked her if she had heard from Jose. "He called me last night," she said. "His mother is dying, poor thing. He's taking 2 weeks off to go to Oaxaca so he can see her before she passes." She took a sip of her latte and looked out the open door to the courtyard. "I know what it's like," she said. "I was with my mother the night she died. She passed in her sleep. Bless her heart." Diane gazed up at the ceiling. "You know," she said, "it was the saddest thing, but it was so important for me to be there." She looked back across the counter at me, and I struggled to find something to say. Diane shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said. "I just feel so bad for Jose. He's such a sweet man." She took another sip of her latte. "And I'll tell you what, he's the best worker we've ever had." She held up a finger. "In 3 years of working for me, this is the very first day he's ever missed." I'm sorry. A couple of weeks later, as Diane sat at the bar drinking another latte, I asked her if there was news from Jose. She glanced at the customers seated on either side of her. "He's still in Oaxaca," she told me, tending to his mother's estate. "Oh," I said. Later in the day, as I was restocking the supply closet, she called to me from the open door, asking me to come outside. We walked to the dirt parking lot, and I stood with Diane under the glaring summer sun. "I didn't want to say this in front of your customers," she began, "but I think Jose is having problems getting back into the country." "What kind of problems?" I said. She looked into the distance. "I don't think he has papers," she told me. "We never asked." I shook my head and looked down at the dirt. "I wish I could have talked to him before he left." "There's nothing you could have said," she told me. "Trust me, there was no stopping him." I looked back up at Diane. "He doesn't know," I said. "Getting back across isn't what it used to be." I turned and stared out at the parked cars, squinting against the sun. "Is there any way to get a hold of him?" I asked. "I can give you his family's number," Diane told me. "The last I heard, he was at the border, trying to get across." "Oh no," I said. "He can't cross now. Not in the summer." Diane looked at me. "I have to talk to him," I said. I closed my eyes and saw images of volcanic stone and swollen bodies, of hospital sheets and blackened skin. "No," I whispered, "not Jose." When I called the house, a small boy answered. I introduced myself as a friend of Jose's. "Are you his son?" I asked. The boy said nothing. "I work with your dad," I continued. "I heard he's at the border trying to get across. Is he okay?" After a long silence, the boy finally spoke. "Do you want my mom to call you?" he asked. "Sure," I said, and then he hung up. Half an hour later, my phone rang. "Soy Lupe." The woman on the other line said, "Esposa de Jose." I introduced myself again as a friend from work and told her I was wondering about Jose. Lupe was silent, as if considering what to say next, how much to tell me. I wanted to blurt out that it was too hot, that it wasn't worth risking his life, that he must wait to cross. "It's funny you called," she finally said, "because I just got off the phone with the Mexican consulate. They called to tell me Jose was arrested 2 days ago by Border Patrol. He has a court hearing later today at 2. They didn't tell me where." I placed the phone in my hand, pressing it hard against my ear. Lupe's voice sounded thin, as if it were all she could do just to repeat what had been said to her. "Today at 2?" I asked. "Yes," she confirmed. I continued pacing in my home, old procedures and timelines rising up in my mind. "I think I know where he'll be," I told her. "Can I call you back?" It had been months since I had seen or talked to Morales, but I called him anyway. "Hey, Vato, do you still work at the courthouse?" I asked. "Simón," he said, "but not today. ¿Por qué?" "I think I have a friend who's getting streamlined," I said. "Shit, a few years out of the patrol and suddenly all your friends are mojados?" I tried to think of a comeback. "I'm just kidding," Morales said before I could reply. "I know how it is. Of course you do." I shot back at him. "Did you think I forgot you're from Douglas? Shit, you could be a mojado yourself and not even know it. You better not forget to wear a uniform when you show up to court, Way. They might deport your ass." Oh, damn, Morales laughed. Shots fired. I asked Morales if streamline proceedings were still open to the public. Yeah, he said. Hippies and protesters come all the time. You never had to go to court? No, I said. Well, you know where the courthouse is downtown? Go to the second floor, the main courtroom, and be there by 1:30. I looked at my watch. Will I be able to see him? I asked. Sure, Morales said, if you can pick him out. There'll probably be 30 or 40 guys today, and everyone will be facing away from you, pendejo. Can his family come? I asked. Sure, he said. I don't know if they're documented, I told him. It shouldn't matter, he assured me. No one will mess with them. Will they be able to talk to him? I asked. No, Morales answered matter-of-factly. But if you sit on the right-hand side of the courtroom in the front 2 rows next to the wall, you should be able to catch his eye as the marshals walk him out. Lupe and I met for the first time outside the courtroom. She came with the pastor from her church and her 3 boys, 15, 10, and 8 years old. All of them called out from school in hopes of seeing their father in court. I held the door to the courtroom open for the family and gestured toward the benches against the right walls. The front rows, I whispered. The proceedings had begun just as we entered the courtroom, and I immediately noticed the smell. A smell I had not encountered in years, the sharp scent of dozens of unwashed bodies that had for days struggled through the desert, skin sweating and sun-baked. The courtroom was cathedral-like, with towering ceilings of brightly colored beams painted in turquoise and coral. From his bench the judge loomed over the room, a small white face emerging from black robes and seated beneath the massive seal of the United States of America, a giant eagle with its head turned as if to look away. I sat next to Lupe, who held her youngest son close to her body, with her oldest son seated beside him. Behind us, the pastor sat with the middle son. The judge addressed the 40-some defendants seated before him, most of them male, all of them wearing black headsets, listening to the words of an interpreter. All of you have been charged with 2 crimes, the judge began. I understand that each of you intends to plead guilty to the petty offense of illegal entry at a place other than one designated for entry by U.S. Immigration. In exchange for your plea, the government has agreed to dismiss the felony offense of reentry after removal. Some of the men hunched over, holding the headsets close to their ears. It is important that you understand this, the judge continued. If you understand, please indicate so by standing. He paused. All the men stood, some rising up from their chairs with their shoulders back and their heads held high as if in defiance, while others seemed barely able to get up from their seats, their bodies slumped, their faces downcast. The maximum penalty for this charge is 6 months in prison and a $5,000 fine, the judge went on. But the government has agreed to waive this fine in exchange for your plea today. I caught the eye of a Border Patrol agent who glared at me as if I were somehow allied against him. I stared at his green uniform, at the badge on his chest, the gun on his belt, the iron-creased lines running down his sleeves. You must understand, the judge continued, that in the future this charge will always be used against you, that if you are arrested attempting to re-enter the country, you could serve years in prison, not days or months. I leaned over to Lupe. Do you see Jose? I asked. I don't know, she said. I can't see their faces. Next to her, her youngest son nervously kicked his dangling legs back and forth. She placed her hand gently on his thigh. Tranquilo, she whispered into his hair. On the floor of the courtroom, the defendants began to file out of their chairs 5 at a time. Their ankles were chained to one another, and their wrists were bound at the waist. They stood before the judge, flanked by court-appointed attorneys, dizzied men and women darting from one client to another in pale suits. The judge began with the person standing to his left. Mr. Amaya, he read, as if from a script, are you a citizen of Mexico? Si. On or about August 31st, 2015, did you enter the United States near Lukeville, Arizona? Si. Did you come through a designated point of entry? No. How do you plead in the charge of illegal entry? Culpable, señor. After repeating this set of questions for each defendant, the judge issued his sentence. For most, 30 days of incarceration in the state detention center an hour north of the city, with credit for time served. One woman, after answering the judge's question, interrupted before he issued her sentence. "I'm pregnant, senor," she said. The judge paused. He looked around as if for guidance. "I'll put a note in your file," he said, "for someone to see you at the facility." Watching the defendant shuffle to the front of the room to stand before the bench, I realized I had never before seen so many men and women in shackles, that I had never laid eyes on a group of people so diminished. I had apprehended and processed countless men and women for deportation, many of whom I sent without thinking to pass through this very room. But there was something dreadfully altered in their presence here between towering and cavernous walls, lorded over by foreign men in colored suits and black robes, men with little notion of the dark desert nights or the hard glare of the sun, with little sense for the sweeping expanses of stone and shale, the foot-packed earthen trails, the bodies laid bare before the elements, the bones trembling from heat, from cold, from want of water. It dawned on me that in my countless encounters with migrants at the hard end of their road through the desert, there was always the closeness of the failed journey, the fading but still hot spark from the last flame of the crossing. But here, in the stale and swirling air of the courthouse, it was clear that something vital had gone missing in the days since apprehension. Some final essence of the spirit had been stamped out or lost in the slow crush of confinement. The pastor leaned forward and pointed toward a gray-haired man who had just stood to walk to the front of the courtroom. "It's your dad," he whispered to the boys. They looked at the man and then at each other. Wide-eyed, "Es él," the pastor said, gesturing again and again. "Es él." The boys sat forward in their seats to get closer. "No está," the boys confirmed with each other. "No, no está." "Yes," the pastor said emphatically, "that's your father. You don't recognize him because he shaves his head, but his hair has grown out and he has stubble now. You can even see his bald spot." "Se ve diferente." The boys looked at each other. "Es él," Lupe said finally. "It's him." The boys sat on their hands, dumbstruck, their mouths agape. Beside me, Lupe slowly doubled over, placing her forearms on her thighs with her palms open at the knees, her head sinking into her hands as she gently rocked in place, cradling herself in her own embrace. As Jose shuffled through a row of chairs, the soft tinkling of his shackles seemed to fill the room. When I finally caught a glimpse of his profile, I saw the face of a man adrift at sea, his eyes scanning the horizons as if out of habit, with little actual hope of sighting land. He wore a sweat-stained t-shirt that seemed to swallow him, and his body appeared small and gaunt and slumped inward, his face and head leathered and speckled with gray hair. As he turned, he caught sight of his 3 sons with their mouths open and their arms draped around their mother, who had finally lifted her head. He gasped audibly, his eyes dilating in disbelief. He looked away and then back again, focusing and unfocusing his vision in confirmation. Quiet sobs began to seize his children, and I wondered if I had done something terrible by bringing them here. Jose took one last look at his family, his mouth slack and twisted, his eyes wide with longing, and then, with great force, he began to thrash his head downward, to and fro as if trying to shake a nightmare upon waking. "I've been thinking a lot about this case," Jose's court-appointed attorney told me when we met a week after the Streamline hearing in an empty hallway outside the courtroom, alone among the 40 or so others who were convicted and sentenced without distinction. Jose had been granted a continuance at the request of his attorney and scheduled for a follow-up hearing. Walter, the attorney, had advised Lupe not to come. "It's too risky to show up at the courthouse without papers," he told her. "But the boys could come," he said. "They're citizens, no problem." And so Lupe took the boys out of school once again to see their father in shackles and asked me if I would bring them. Of course, I said. You know, Walter continued, I woke up thinking about Mr. Martinez in the middle of the night. It's not that his situation is unique, because it's not, but it's unusual to see so much support for someone in the courtroom, to see their family right there in the gallery. Walter was silent for several seconds. I have a son, he said, gesturing toward Jose's oldest. They're the same age. I woke up this morning and I could hear my son out in the kitchen. It got me thinking. No father should be kept from his family this way. No father should have a young son and wake up unable to hear him in the next room. As I sat listening to Walter on a dark wooden bench, Jose's boys chased one another down the empty hallway, and I wondered how the wide corridors of the courthouse must seem to them as they slid across the waxed floors. Watching them, I realized I had little understanding of the place myself. I thought of the countless documents I had filed out during my years in Border Patrol. Voluntary return papers, expedited removal forms, reinstatements of prior deportation orders, documents sorted through by clerks and attorneys and judges, documents that followed the accused as they were shuttled across the state from one holding cell to the next. I realized, too, that despite my small role within the system, despite hours of training and studying at the academy, I had little inkling of what happened to those I arrested after I turned over their paperwork and went home from my shift. For several minutes, Walter and I sat next to each other in silence. My mind had filled with questions, but I was wary of seeming too curious, wary that Walter might sense my old allegiance to the agency that was so often positioned against him. I asked sheepishly if he could explain to me why he had asked for the continuance. He thought about how best to explain. Well, he began, I'll start with the basics. There's criminal law and civil law. You probably know that. Charges related to illegal border crossing are criminal charges. So last week's hearing and this week's follow-up are both criminal proceedings. But citizenship and immigration fall under the umbrella of civil law. I nodded, remembering my tests at the academy. Walter went on. You've got to understand that most undocumented border crossers don't have any claim to citizenship or immigration status. But Jose's got family here. His kids are citizens. That's why I interjected during the streamline hearing last week and asked the judge to delay Jose's sentencing. I hoped a continuance would give him some time to find an actual immigration lawyer, to see if they can put together a claim to be heard in civil court. They found someone, I said. The owner of the Mercado is friends with a good lawyer. That's lucky, he said. Who is it? Elizabeth Green, I told him. Well, he replied, that's very lucky. Elizabeth has a great reputation. He glanced down the hallway at Vicente, Jose's youngest boy. I think she just had a baby, he added. Walter turned back to me. I'll tell you what's going to happen today, he said. Mr. Martinez will still have to plead guilty to the misdemeanor crime of illegal entry. Like everyone you saw last week. In turn, the government will offer him the same deal as before, dismissing the felony charge of re-entry and sentencing him to 30 days in prison. Then, boom, Jose is done with the criminal charges. That's when things change. Instead of being immediately deported after fulfilling his sentence, Jose will then get kicked over into an immigration proceeding, the civil case. Elizabeth will be the one handling all that. The family will meet her in the meantime and they'll put together an argument. I don't know much about the intricacies of immigration law, except that it's not free. You don't get a public defender like me. You gotta pay to play. Walter gazed down the hallway at Jose's boys. You know, he said, it's difficult to see a man's life torn apart. A lot of people in the immigration system lose sight of people's humanity. I see it every day here. He gestured at the air all around him. The Border Patrol agents, the marshals, I see here day in and day out. They objectify these people all the time. I clenched my jaw, not wanting to reveal myself. I know a guy who works here, I told him. Oh yeah, he asked. What's his name? Morales. Shit, Walter said. I know Morales. He paused. I don't want to say anything bad about your buddy, but that Morales is a very serious guy. He's always seemed a bit callous to me. Yanking on people, pushing their chairs around, stuff like that. I looked at Walter and held my tongue. You know, he said, as a public defender, I've represented all sorts of people. I've even represented Border Patrol agents. One of my clients was framed by his own colleagues in the patrol because he was too human, because he showed too much compassion in the line of duty. The other agents didn't like him because he didn't play along with them, you know. He carried an injured woman on his back through the desert, and the other agents started thinking he was soft. They didn't trust him, didn't like working with him, so they set the guy up. They framed him for brutality. They made it look like he had beaten someone up in the field. Isn't that twisted? I nodded. I tell you, Walter said, the Border Patrol, the marshals, it's like they forget about kindness. I've almost never seen these guys express any humanity, any emotion. I don't know how they do it. How do you come home to your kids at night when you spend your day treating other humans like dogs? Jose, dressed in bright prisoner orange, listened intently through a headset as the judge spoke to him. I understand that you intend to plead guilty to the petty offense of illegal entry at a place other than one designated for entry by U.S. immigration. In exchange for your plea, the government has agreed to dismiss the felony offense of reentry after removal. This time Jose was the lone defendant in a modest-sized courtroom with few other occupants. Walter sat next to him, and along the wall sat two marshals, both in dark suits, one of them tall with an angry pockmarked face, his gaze alternating intently between Jose and his boys. In a booth beside the judge's bench, a dark-skinned interpreter spoke hushed Spanish into a headset. You must understand, the judge continued, that in the future this charge will always be used against you, that if you are arrested attempting to re-enter the country, you could serve years in prison, not days or months. Next to me, Jose Jr. drew a stick figure on the outside of an envelope. Look, he whispered to me, it's my brother. Mr. Martinez, said the judge, are you a citizen of Mexico? Si. On or about September 1st, 2015, did you enter the United States near Yuma, Arizona? Si. Did you come through a designated port of entry? No, señor. How do you plead in the charge of illegal entry? Culpable, señor. After the hearing, Walter and I sat again on a long bench outside the courtroom while the boys loped around the hallway, then disappeared. The sounds of their hollow yelling echoed out from the bathroom. You know, Walter told me, if Mr. Martinez hadn't left the country to see his dying mother, he would have been protected by the executive orders issued by President Obama. The orders granted provisional status and deferred deportation to non-criminal parents of U.S. citizens. Jose would have been home free. At the end of the hallway, Jose's boys became visible again. And I called out to Diego, the oldest. The other boys followed, pushing and circling each other behind him. What's with the yelling in the bathroom? I said. I don't know, Diego said. We were just yelling because of the echo. Suddenly the doors to the courtroom opened in front of us, and the tall man with the pockmarked face came striding out. He walked slowly over to the boys, now sitting at the far end of the bench. He stood craning over them and looked each of them in the face. Was that your dad in there? He asked. Yeah, Diego said meekly. Well, the man said, pausing for a moment, I'm sorry about your dad. Sometimes I feel pretty bad for you guys. He peered down at his chest and unfastened a small lapel pin with his massive hands. He grasped the pin in his fingers and stretched his arm out to Diego like a pilot offering his wings to a small boy. Diego took the pin, and the man turned and walked back into the courtroom as Diego contemplated the object of his palm. In his palm. That's interesting, said Walter. I see that man in here all the time. I've never once seen him express any emotion. He shook his head. That's the first attempt at kindness I've ever witnessed here. I raised my eyebrows at him. Some people have more compassion than they let on, I told him. Later, as I left the courtroom with the boys, I asked Diego if I could see the pin. He continued walking forward without stopping. Show it to him, said Jose Jr., the middle brother. He nudged Diego's shoulder. Reluctantly, Diego reached into his pocket. He clutched the pin in his fist, as if it had become something precious to him, then dropped it into my hand. The pin was heavy, made of real brass. It was a small star ringed by the words, United States Marshal. A tiny badge.